They made America laugh, while hiding a truth that could have ended everything. What if some of the most familiar faces on television weren't just acting on screen, but performing in real life too? Behind the bright lights and harmless sitcom smiles, there were secrets carefully protected, identities rewritten, and lives lived in silence. Tonight, we're uncovering what Hollywood never wanted audiences to question. And one story changes everything. George Nader, The Man and the Challenge, 1959. At first glance, George Nader fit perfectly into the television world of the late 50s. Clean-cut, dependable, believable. He carried the kind of presence studios trusted. Someone who could anchor a show without drawing unwanted attention. But attention found him anyway. Not from audiences, but from within the industry itself. Whispers began quietly. Not public, not confirmed. Just enough to circulate behind closed doors. And, in Hollywood at that time, that was enough. Careers didn't collapse overnight. They faded. Opportunities became limited. Roles stopped coming. No official reason, no statement, just silence. That's what makes Nader's story different. There was no scandal, no dramatic exposure, just a gradual disappearance that reflected how the system worked. If your identity didn't fit the image, you didn't get rewritten, you got removed. And the most unsettling part? Audiences never knew why. They just watched someone disappear, without explanation. Hans Conried, The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, 1959. Hans Conried had a presence you couldn't quite categorize. His voice, his delivery, his timing. Everything felt slightly heightened. See, almost theatrical in a way that stood apart from the grounded realism of most sitcom performances. In The Many Loves of Dobie Gillis, that difference worked in his favor. He added a layer of unpredictability, a tone that made even simple scenes feel more deliberate. But that distinctiveness also placed him in a careful position within the industry. Conried never fit the traditional leading man image, and because of that, his roles often leaned into exaggerated or eccentric characters, safe spaces where individuality could exist without raising direct questions. Off-screen, his personal life remained largely private, not hidden through elaborate stories, but contained through distance. Interviews stayed focused on work. Public appearances revealed little. It was a controlled visibility, present, but never fully open. What makes Conried's story compelling is that balance. He didn't disappear, and he didn't conform completely. Instead, he existed just outside the expected mold, without ever crossing a line Hollywood wasn't willing to accept. Paul Hartman, The Andy Griffith Show, 1960. Paul Hartman brought something subtle to television, an ease that didn't demand attention, but held it anyway. On The Andy Griffith Show, his presence felt natural, almost effortless, blending into the world of Mayberry without disrupting its calm rhythm. That was his strength. He didn't need to dominate a scene to be remembered, but that same quietness extended beyond the screen. Hartman's personal life was rarely discussed, not because it was intentionally hidden through elaborate stories, but because it was kept at a distance. In an industry built on image, sometimes the safest approach wasn't to create a narrative. It was to avoid one entirely. There were no public contradictions, no moments that forced attention in a specific direction, just a steady career, a recognizable face, and a life that remained largely undefined outside of his work. And in that era, that kind of absence could be just as deliberate as any carefully constructed image. What makes Hartman's story stand out isn't controversy. It's restraint. The ability to exist within the system without ever giving it a reason to react. Because sometimes, survival in Hollywood didn't come from hiding the truth. It came from never letting it become part of the conversation at all. Billy DeWolf, The Doris Day Show, 1968. Billy DeWolf had a presence that felt unmistakable the moment he appeared on screen. His delivery carried a sharp elegance, precise, expressive, and often just a step ahead of everyone else in the scene. In the Doris Day Show, that energy translated into characters who felt polished, witty, and slightly removed from the everyday world around them. But that distinct style also placed him in a carefully defined space within Hollywood. DeWolf wasn't shaped into a traditional leading man. Instead, he occupied roles that allowed personality to shine, without forcing audiences to question what existed beyond the performance. It was a controlled kind of visibility, where expression was welcomed, as long as it stayed within character. Off-screen, his personal life remained largely unspoken, not denied publicly, not confirmed either, just left outside the frame. And in that era, that silence carried meaning. It reflected an understanding of how the system worked, where too much clarity could shift perception in ways that weren't reversible. What makes DeWolf's story compelling is how naturally he fit into that balance. He didn't challenge the system directly, but he didn't disappear within it either. He existed in a space where individuality could be seen, but never fully explained. Jesse White, The Beverly Hillbillies, 1962. Jesse White rarely played characters you fully trusted, and that was exactly why he worked so well. In The Beverly Hillbillies, his presence added a layer of tension beneath the comedy. There was always something slightly off, something calculated behind the humor, even when the scene itself felt light. That ability to balance charm with unease made him valuable. He could shift tone without breaking it, exist within the world of the show while subtly standing apart from it. And in an era where sitcoms relied on familiarity, that difference mattered. Off-screen, White's life remained largely out of focus, not hidden through elaborate narratives, but never fully explored either. He stayed within the boundaries the industry expected, visible enough to remain relevant, but private enough to avoid scrutiny. There's something deliberate in that kind of presence. The idea that you can be recognized everywhere, yet never fully known. It mirrors the roles he played, figures who appeared open, but always held something back. And that's where the tension settles, not in what was revealed, but in what consistently stayed just out of reach. Because sometimes, the most convincing performance isn't the one written into the script. It's the one that continues long after the cameras stop. Everett Horton, The Hathaways, 1961. Everett Horton brought a kind of nervous precision to every role he played. His voice, his timing, the way he carried himself. It all felt carefully measured, as if every movement had already been decided before the scene even began. In The Hathaways, that energy translated into characters who felt both controlled and slightly unsettled, never entirely comfortable within their surroundings. That distinct style made him memorable, but it also placed him outside the traditional mold. Horton wasn't positioned as a leading man in the conventional sense. Instead, he existed in a category of his own, recognizable, dependable, but never fully defined by the expectations placed on others. Off-screen, his personal life followed a similar pattern. There were no public declarations, no direct confirmations, just a consistent distance between who he was professionally and what existed beyond that space. It wasn't secrecy in the dramatic sense. It was structure. What makes Horton's story stand out is how long that structure held. Decades of work, countless appearances, and yet the boundary remained intact. And that's what creates the unease. Not that something was hidden, but that it never needed to be revealed to have meaning. Because sometimes, silence isn't absence, it's control. Dick Sargent, Bewitched, 1969. Dick Sargent stepped into a role that already existed. Bewitched had established its rhythm, its tone, its expectations. And he entered as a replacement, taking on a character audiences already recognized. That alone created pressure. Continuity had to be maintained. Familiarity couldn't break. And on the surface, it worked. Sargent adapted quickly, aligning himself with the world of the show in a way that felt seamless enough to keep the illusion intact. The character remained consistent. The structure held. But behind that transition was a different kind of reality, one that wasn't visible during the height of his career. Like many others in that era, Sargent's personal life existed outside the narrative audiences were given. It wasn't openly discussed. It wasn't part of the image being presented. What makes his story more striking is what came later. Years after his time on Bewitched, Sargent spoke openly about his identity, in a way that wouldn't have been possible during the show's original run. And that shift in timing reveals something important. The truth didn't change. The environment did. And that raises a question that lingers beneath everything. How many identities remained hidden, not because they couldn't be seen, but because they couldn't be accepted? Paul Winchell, The Dick Van Dyke Show, 1961. Paul Winchell operated in a space that blurred performance and reality in a way few others did. Known primarily as a ventriloquist, he built his career on creating voices, personalities, and characters that existed alongside him. On The Dick Van Dyke Show, even in guest appearances, that layered performance carried through. There was always more happening beneath the surface than what was immediately visible. That idea of multiple identities existing at once feels almost symbolic when looking at his place within the industry. Winchell's public persona was clear, defined, and widely accepted. Entertainer, performer, personality. But like many others in that era, what existed beyond that persona remained separate, carefully contained. There were no direct confrontations with expectation, no moments where the illusion risked breaking. Instead, there was alignment, staying within the roles that allowed expression without forcing definition. What makes Winchell's story compelling isn't controversy, it's structure. The way performance itself became a form of protection. When your career is built on characters, on voices that aren't your own, it creates distance between identity and perception. And that distance matters, because in an industry that demanded clarity, ambiguity could be safer. Winchell didn't need to explain who he was. He simply gave audiences something else to focus on, and they never looked past it. Jim Nabors, Gomer Pyle, USMC. 1964/The Andy Griffith Show, 1960. Jim Nabors became a symbol of innocence at a time when television depended on it. As Gomer Pyle, he wasn't just a character, he was an idea. Gentle, trusting, uncomplicated. A figure audiences could accept without hesitation. That simplicity was powerful. It made him widely loved, instantly recognizable, and deeply embedded in the cultural landscape of the time. But it also created a boundary. The image was so specific, so carefully maintained, that anything outside of it had to remain separate. During his years on The Andy Griffith Show, and later Gomer Pyle, USMC, there were quiet rumors, subtle awareness within the industry. But nothing was confirmed. Nothing was addressed. The image held firm. And that's what makes Nabors' story different. The silence wasn't filled with denial or distraction. It was simply maintained. A gap between public identity and private reality that remained untouched for decades. It wasn't until much later in life that Nabors spoke openly about who he was, in a world that had already begun to change. And that timing is important, because it reveals the contrast between what was possible then and what wasn't. At the height of his fame, the truth could have disrupted everything. So it stayed unspoken. And that absence, quiet, consistent, unchallenged, became part of the performance itself. When the laughter felt real, the stories did not. Behind every smile, there were boundaries you were never meant to see. Lines no one was allowed to cross. And once you notice it, the illusion doesn't disappear. It shifts. Because this wasn't just entertainment, it was control. And the question that remains is simple. How much of what you watched was ever real? Charles Nelson Reilly, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, 1968. 340+ words. Charles Nelson Reilly never blended in, and that was both his advantage and his limitation. On screen, His presence was unmistakable. The voice, the delivery, the mannerisms, everything felt heightened, almost deliberately theatrical in a way that separated him from the grounded performances around him. In The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, that energy created a unique contrast. While the show leaned into warmth and familiarity, Reilly introduced something less predictable, a subtle tension, a sense that he didn't fully belong within the world he was part of, and that made him impossible to ignore. But that visibility came with boundaries. Reilly existed in a space where audiences could recognize difference, without ever naming it. It was understood, but never confirmed, present, but never acknowledged. And that balance wasn't accidental, it was necessary. Because in that era, crossing from implication into confirmation could change everything. Careers didn't always end dramatically. Sometimes they simply shifted. Opportunities narrowed. Visibility faded. Reilly understood that line. And more importantly, he stayed just on the safe side of it. Years later, he would speak more openly about his life, which in a way that reflected a world that had already begun to change. But during his peak years, that openness wasn't an option. So instead, he performed within a carefully defined space, not hiding, not revealing, just existing, in between. And that space, uncertain, controlled, and quietly understood, is where his entire career was built. Richard Deacon, The Dick Van Dyke Show, 1961/Leave It to Beaver. 1957. Richard Deacon built his career on structure, authority figures, executives, men who controlled situations rather than reacted to them. In The Dick Van Dyke Show and Leave It to Beaver, he became a symbol of order, predictable, composed, and entirely consistent. And that consistency extended beyond the screen. Because unlike others who relied on carefully constructed public narratives, yet Deacon's approach was different. He didn't create an illusion. He created an absence. There were no widely publicized relationships, no stories designed to redirect attention, no visible contradictions. His personal life existed in a space that audiences simply never saw. And in that era, that silence wasn't accidental. It was strategic. Hollywood didn't always require deception. Sometimes it relied on omission, the idea that if nothing is presented, nothing can be questioned. Deacon fit perfectly into that system. His roles reinforced a clear, dependable image, and nothing outside of that image ever disrupted it. But behind that consistency was a different reality, one that remained known within industry circles, yet never crossed into public awareness. Not because it couldn't, but because it wasn't allowed to. And that's where the tension lies. Not in what was hidden, but in how effectively it stayed hidden. Because Deacon didn't just play controlled characters. He lived within a controlled narrative, one where the most important details were never written into the script and never meant to be seen. Paul Lynde, Bewitched, 1964. Paul Lynde is where everything changes. Because unlike everyone else on this list, he didn't disappear into the system. He exposed it. On Bewitched, Lynde's performances as Uncle Arthur were sharp, exaggerated, and impossible to ignore. Every line delivery carried intention. Every reaction felt amplified. He didn't blend into scenes. He disrupted them, and audiences loved him for it. But beneath that humor was something far more complex. Lynde didn't fit the traditional mold Hollywood tried to enforce. And yet, he wasn't hidden in the way others were. His identity existed in a space that felt visible, without ever being officially acknowledged. And that contradiction is what makes his story the most revealing. Because everyone knew. The industry knew. The audiences sensed it. The performance itself hinted at it. But no one said it. That silence wasn't accidental. It was the system at work. A space where something could be openly recognized, as long as it was never confirmed. Because confirmation meant confrontation, and confrontation meant risk. So Lynde existed in between, not concealed, not declared, just present. And that presence pushed against the limits of what television allowed at the time. He came closer than anyone else to breaking the illusion. And yet, the illusion held. That's what makes his story different. He didn't just survive within the system. He revealed how it functioned, without ever saying a word. And once you see that, once you understand how visibility and silence work together, everything else on this list starts to feel less like coincidence and more like design. The jokes were simple. The reality wasn't. Behind every familiar face was a line no one was allowed to cross, where identity stopped and performance began. And once you see it, the laughter feels different. Because this wasn't just television. It was control disguised as comfort. And the real question is, how many truths were hidden in plain sight, waiting to be noticed?